Sliders, a novel by Brad Lineweaver. Prologue. Quinn Mallory was angry. He'd never felt anything like this before. Only in his early 20s, he'd been mad and jealous and pissed off and unhappy many times. He thought he knew what it meant to be angry. But this was the first time he'd seen men in uniform beat up unarmed people. He had never watched a 10-year-old girl having her teeth kicked in, or her slightly older brother falling on top of her, gasping out his life from a red mouth and redder wound where his throat had been cut. Everything manly in Quinn Mallory screamed that he should do something, anything. Life wasn't so precious that he should keep it at the cost of living with these horrible sights. But he held himself back. 2 of his best friends were with him, and he didn't want to put their lives at risk. An older man he admired more than any other living person, and a young woman who meant the world to him. The 3 of them were on one side of a fence. The terrible things were happening on the other side. Adrenaline pumped through Quinn like liquid fire. He held on to the woman's hand, feeling her muscles tense up. She wanted to do something, too. She probably restrained herself for his sake, the same way he was doing for her. The older man took the sight of the atrocities more stoically. He'd half expected to see this sort of thing in this place, even as the soldiers rounded up the crying women and the silent, beaten men. Some of the soldiers were young and frightened. They couldn't keep the terror from showing in their eyes. They shared with their victims the strange emotional link between the torturer and the tortured. As the machine guns made a sound like old bones breaking against a picket fence, and the first row of human beings turned into hundreds of pounds of fresh meat, Quinn Mallory felt something disconnect inside him. The analytical part of his scientifically trained brain took over and saved him from throwing up. He made himself observe details about the soldiers' weapons and the cut of their uniforms, and then he noticed the shabby clothes of the victims. It was the middle of the night, but the carnage was all too easy to witness. Floodlights spared the onlookers nothing. Quinn noticed the full moon providing a spotlight in the clear night sky as if the killers were being observed by the universe. Quinn looked at the flag of the soldiers, painted on the side of a tank. 2 line segments crossing each other and forming a sinister symbol he never thought he'd see in the streets of San Francisco. Looking at the symbol reminded him of a conversation he'd had with his father years ago. Quinn could go for weeks without thinking about Dad and how he died, but then something would happen to bring back the memories. When younger, Quinn rarely had said things typical of other teenagers, but he'd been cramming for a test during one of their Saturdays together, and the words just slipped out. History is boring. That's like saying life is boring, replied Michael Mallory. The 2 of them were fishing off an old wooden dock, looking at a red sunset. The last of the daylight drained away as though the sky had been dealt a mortal blow. Quinn never liked his father's silences, especially when they followed a philosophical remark. The son had to answer the father somehow. I guess it's the way they teach historical stuff that makes it dull. Names and dates, eh? His father let him save face. Quinn nodded. Well, son, you have a point there. He paused to relight his pipe. History is every bit as interesting as quantum mechanics, the elder Mallory continued, bringing up a subject about which he and his son had no disagreement. A professor of theoretical physics, Michael Mallory had experienced his greatest pride when discovering that his son was a chip off the old block. The tests aren't interesting. Quinn held his own. Dad laughed. The subatomic level is fascinating because of its unpredictability, he continued. So is history, when you realize all the events that could have occurred at any given moment. You and I are here as a result of a series of imponderable accidents, a million what-might-have-beens in a sequence finally producing the Mallory family. Dad loved to lecture. At least he was good at it, and interesting. Quinn wished Dad was his history teacher, but Mallory was too busy with his own work for anything else. And Quinn didn't doubt that one day his father would achieve something really important. Death was impossible. It couldn't stop Quinn's father before his work was done, except it did when he was run down by a car. Just as death couldn't stop the lives of children on a cold San Francisco night, except that it did. Or put their parents, maddened with grief, up against a wall and put them out of their misery. Or threaten everyone staring in horror at what was happening in an American city right now, right in front of them. Finally, there were only men left to shoot under the cold, icy moon. The soldiers felt better about that. Now that the women and children were already disappearing under a mound of male bodies, the soldiers became more efficient, almost happy in their work. They weren't about to run out of ammunition. Other bystanders gathered to watch the spectacle. A soldier on the spectator side of the fence acted like an usher when a movie had been sold out. He came over and gestured for the crowd to disperse, except he used a gun instead of a flashlight. Quinn and his friends took the hint. Right before turning away, Quinn Mallory witnessed something that so scorched his mind that he promised himself never to admit what he saw. Some things should be private. The last body to fall, before Quinn turned away, came to rest with its staring, dead eyes looking straight at him. It was like gazing into a mirror from hell. His own face, streaked with blood, added to the pile of corpses growing ever larger under the crimson symbol of the hammer and sickle. Chapter 1. The skeletal old man in Golden Gate Park was a fixture, as if part of the bench he slept on. He'd been there for so long that the locals paid no attention. Tourists to San Francisco happening upon him would stop and listen for a short while. The old man followed a rigorous schedule, always doing his harangues at the same times in the morning and afternoon. The police generally left him alone. Everyone called the man Crazy Kenny. Quinn Mallory didn't know why he stopped and listened on this sunny, windy day. Maybe it was because he wasn't late for class. Normally Quinn was a blur of motion going past Crazy Kenny. If the old orator noticed him, he probably concluded that here was a young man who would never see the light. Class was over today. Quinn had all the time he wanted before returning home, where his mother was making dinner for both of them. It was on a day like this that Quinn's father had stepped in front of a speeding car and ended a promising career. His career had been merely promising for so long that the elder Mallory had started wondering if he would ever amount to anything. In this way, the hypercritical mind that so often analyzed every aspect of his son finally began to turn on itself. Quinn had never seen his father so depressed until a few months before the accident. It was very important for both Quinn and his mother to believe that Dr. Michael Mallory died accidentally. Dr. Mallory lived to see his son accepted into graduate school at the prestigious University of Berkeley as a top student in physics. For the second time in Quinn's life, his father said he was proud of his son. The other time had occurred when Quinn received a failing grade his senior year of high school for writing a paper about the Korean War. Quinn had argued that General Douglas MacArthur should have been allowed to prosecute the war through to a victory against the North, even if it meant the use of atomic weapons, even if it meant a showdown with communist China. Quinn didn't think that any longer. His views had gone through a lot of changes since he'd been a teenager. But after his father challenged him to think for himself, Quinn honestly convinced himself of the proposition he advanced in his paper. The essay was not calculated to receive an A grade unless the teacher was as concerned with objectivity and fairness as Michael Mallory. She wasn't. But Quinn received the grade he cared about, his father's approval. "Incidentally, I think you're crazy," he told his son. "We should never have entered the Korean War in the first place. But that's the best paper you've ever written, and your teacher proved she isn't fit to read it." On a bright afternoon in September, Crazy Kenny brought these memories back to Quinn. The old man listed America's various wars of imperialism and stopped for a moment on Korea before moving on to his favorite subject, Vietnam. "The American war machine could not turn back the forces of history in Asia," Kenny howled. "The peasants, through newly discovered class consciousness, proved themselves worthy. They produced a revolutionary vanguard against rapacious Western capitalism." A woman with a British accent challenged him. Crazy Kenny beamed, his toothless mouth forming a smile. He wasn't used to this much attention. "You ought to be in Hyde Park," the woman told him, adding, "If the forces of history are on our side, then how do you explain the collapse of the Soviet Union?" "That was a corrupted form of state capitalism," he said, adjusting the filthy cap that never left his head, even when he slept. Then he launched into a long diatribe about how the last generation of Soviet leadership had betrayed Lenin's great dream. Quinn reached in his pocket and pulled out a candy bar with lots of nuts in it. He figured that Crazy Kenny had provided enough entertainment for one afternoon. He waved at the statue of Abraham Lincoln dominating the park, a little habit picked up in childhood. He needed to get back to the lab. Mom was great about letting him have the basement entirely to himself. He was performing an experiment there. He felt pretty good about how things were going. It wasn't every day you discovered something that would change the world forever. Jogging over to his vintage 2002 BMW, he finished wolfing down the candy bar. He wanted to stop over at the Doppler supercomputer store, where he had a part-time job. It was his day off, but he wanted to see a good friend there named Wade. She wasn't exactly a girlfriend, but a lot of people thought she and Quinn were an item. He felt toward her as he would have felt for the sister he'd never had. He wanted to share his big discovery with her. He'd get around to it sooner or later, but as he shifted into first and started pulling out into traffic, he changed his mind about stopping off at the store. There would be time enough to introduce her to his discovery after he'd solved one little problem. He didn't really know what the hell he'd stumbled on, but it was very real and scary. He needed to figure out how it worked. As he stopped at a red light, he grimaced at a sudden realization. For years, his father had knocked himself out trying to do something big. If anyone deserved a breakthrough, it was Michael Mallory. Instead, the gods winked, did a card trick, and the son stumbled into a genuine, accept-no-substitutes miracle. "What are you inventing down there?" his mother would ask him every now and again. "Anti-gravity," he'd call up from the basement. "Anti-gravity," he'd say as he grabbed a piece of toast in the morning and called it breakfast. "Anti-gravity," he'd mutter in his sleep when she'd come in late at night to check on him. It had been a joke at first. Then it became the focus of the experiment. Working alone in his basement with fields of energy, he listened to an expert on NPR explain why the days of the one-man inventor were over. The same guy was on the car radio right now, explaining why human beings would never travel faster than light. "I bet you don't believe in time travel either," Quinn said to the radio. "You're probably the grandson of the man who wanted to close down the patent office early in the century because there was nothing new to invent. Well, how do you explain my—" He almost said anti-gravity, but stopped. There was a very good reason for this. He had not yet succeeded. "Serendipity," he said to the inattentive car radio. "Pure dumb luck, and it happens to me." "Smart luck," an inner voice corrected him. "Chance favors the prepared mind." "But what is it?" he asked aloud. "If I'm such a genius, why can't I give it a name?" He almost forgot he was out of blank videotape for the official record of the experiment. Abruptly changing lanes in traffic made the car behind him hit the brakes and the horn. "Damn," said Quinn, feeling apologetic and stupid at the same time. He'd promised his mother that he would pay better attention to the macro realm often referred to as the real world. If he got wiped out in traffic, it would kill her. He was sure of that. Too much symmetry is as bad as too much irony. And he mustn't give her the wrong demonstration of the old saw, like father, like son. He'd give her the right demonstration. The name Mallory would be hailed along with Newton and Darwin and Einstein and Crick and Watson and von Braun and Teller and Edison and Tesla. The list unscrolled, world without end. Quinn would be remembered for an engineering feat, a scientific breakthrough, and he'd have a place in the mathematics column just as soon as he would deal with the unfinished equation on the blackboard in his basement. Quite a lot to come out of one experiment. Bargain Video was in a small, mini shopping center right next to a bar. He hurried inside the video store and grabbed a pack of 5 standard high-grade VHS tapes with an EP running time of 6 hours and an SP of 2. He didn't trust the tapes that ran up to 8 hours. There were some things man was not meant to do. He didn't make any more stops on the way home. Home was a spacious old house with high ceilings and big windows that provided such good air circulation that there was no need for air conditioning. Of course, many residences in San Francisco could make the same boast. When the wind chill factor forced Quinn to wear sweaters in the middle of the summer, he sometimes wondered if SF didn't stand for science fiction instead of San Francisco. He didn't know anyone else still living in the house in which he'd grown up, and still with his mother. At first, he stayed because of good practical economics. After his father died, Mom did everything short of begging him to stay. Under the circumstances, it was an easy call. The gardener was trimming shrubs as Quinn parked on the Thursday side of the street and crossed over. "Hi, Jake," he called out. "Hi, Quinn. Your mom's home." "Thanks," he said, opening the white gate that always creaked no matter what he did to it. Although money was tight, Mom didn't need to give up anything she took for granted. As good a definition of the middle-class lifestyle as any. Jake was the first luxury that Quinn would let go. Not because of any antipathy for the man, but because he assumed he himself could do the work of the gardener. His mother did not agree. She had the idea that her son was the perfect absent-minded professor, just like his father, and neither of them had ever been useful in the yard. As he entered the house, he heard her in the kitchen. He looked at the picture she kept in the hall bookcase. There were bookcases in every room except the bathroom. The picture had been taken the last time all 3 of them had been together, and Dad had signed it, "To Amanda and Quinn, may we always be together." "Quinn?" she called out. "You're home early today?" "No, I'm late," he answered with a smile. "You caught me before I got down to the basement." She came into the hall, drying her hands on her apron. She had retained her cheerleader looks into her 40s, though she'd put on some weight in a few places. She liked to joke that she was still a hippie chick, a refugee from the 60s. Maybe that helped keep her young. Certainly Quinn sometimes felt older than his mother. She was easy to love. "I thought I heard you down there earlier," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "Hope I didn't disturb anything." It took a moment for her words to sink in. "You went down there today?" he asked. "Well, I thought I smelled something burning. You know how much I worry about fires." He didn't want to be rude, but he ran for the basement before she could finish saying, "It's all right, hon, there wasn't any fire." He opened the door on which Mom had taped a picture of Peter Cushing in the role of Baron Frankenstein. He went through so fast that he scared Schrödinger. The family cat didn't like to be bumped when he'd found a nice, comfortable spot on the first step leading to Quinn's sanctum sanctorum. He reached the bottom step of the stairs and flipped on a series of breakers, the light revealing an elaborate home laboratory. There weren't any test tubes or beakers or transformers. No Jacob's ladder sputtered or zapped. But there was a lot of computer equipment, and a blackboard along with a video camera set on a tripod. Several shelves, looking like stereo racks, were full of complex wiring. There were keyboards and face tubes and oscilloscopes with screens displaying fluctuating wave patterns. Mom thought of Quinn as a mad scientist. From the look of her son's lab, one would infer that her instincts were very good. Quinn heaved a sigh of relief. The optical table was as he left it, with a series of holes drilled into its top. The laser and electron microscopes were still anchored to the table. Over in a corner, a doorless refrigerator was surrounded by small tanks and connected by multiple wires to a dewar, a 100-gallon stainless steel cylinder with frozen tubes coming out of the top and sweating steam like a hyperventilating demon. Now that he thought about it, the place was a bit like a mad scientist's lab after all. Only one thing mattered. Mom hadn't accidentally activated his discovery. He wasn't sure that it was dangerous, but he didn't want to find out that he was mistaken at the cost of losing his mother. "Are you all right?" His mother had followed him downstairs. He hugged her and kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said, speaking the formula that could always turn any problem into gold. "You were worried I'd disturb your big secret down here." "Nah," he said, holding her more tightly. "I just don't want you to find the monster I've slapped together." "If it's anything like your cooking, then it's a monster indeed," she laughed, poking at him. "I'd no more disturb your creations than alter what your father did down here." She nodded at the cabinet over by the corner. Its doors opened and closed courtesy of an old piece of equipment that operated the flaps of an airplane. The Mallory family was very pragmatic. "Thanks," said Quinn. "I not only love you, but I trust you." Her hand moved involuntarily to her eyes. She had a tendency to cry when she was happy. "I'll let you get back to your monster. Besides, my experiment is waiting in the kitchen." He waited until she had closed the door before he slowly walked up the stairs and quietly locked it. Then he came back down and went over to the blackboard, which was filled with a complex mathematical equation that ended with a big question mark. After studying the intimidating array of symbols, Quinn frowned and asked his cat, "What am I doing wrong? You'd think after 3 months I'd be able to crack it. Some genius." He sighed and went over to the videotape machine positioned over a TV set, then opened one of the new videotapes. He pulled off a pre-labeled sticker that said Experiment Diary, affixed it to the cassette, and inserted it in the VCR. After taking a deep breath, he hit the record button and stood in front of the camera. He unlocked a drawer and removed a small device that looked like a remote control. It could have been part of the video equipment, but it wasn't. He used the device to turn on his monster. In the center of the room there was a sound, a whooshing that never became louder, but did grow more intense. Something happened to the air. It tasted funny. Next came a new crackling sound, followed by static electricity that made Quinn's hair stand on end. Something unearthly formed before his face, right out of thin air, about 5 feet off the ground. It was donut-shaped. At first, it had the texture of a purple smoke ring, shimmering, diaphanous, reflective. Then it took on a harder look. It had a diameter of nearly 6 feet. The dominant color was blue, spreading out as if ink had been dropped in a pool of water. He didn't feel the tug from the circle until the whirlpool effect began, and then there was a rushing wind sucking at him, pulling at his hair and his clothes, beckoning him to enter. To enter. A tunnel. The 3-dimensional effect came very close to being the most startling aspect of Quinn's monster. At first glance, only one thing topped it. Quinn walked around the shimmering blue thing hanging in the center of his basement. The damned thing was actually 2-dimensional. Faced head-on, it was a tunnel leading to God knows where. But if you walked to the side, it simply disappeared. For a fraction of an instant. Because if you kept walking, It reappeared again, from the other side. There was no tunnel into the void on the backside. From that angle, it became a shimmering circle of water distortion effects, through which he could see the wall of the basement, as if peering through the thick glass walls of an aquarium. He never got tired of looking at the rippling shapes in the funhouse. From this side, everything he saw was known. On the other side, there was the unknown. "Today, I've decided," he began and stopped. The trouble with discovering something unprecedented was the accompanying ambivalence. Quinn popped out the new tape and grabbed the most recently recorded one, rewound it, and started watching himself. Appearing more disheveled than usual, he stared at himself through the monitor the day he had stumbled onto the big mystery. "September 13th, he'd said. "My attempt to create the world's first anti-gravity device has taken a decidedly bizarre turn. Accidents will happen. Anti-gravity? Something else. Definitely. But what?" He fast-forwarded. "September 21st. After days of careful analysis, I've come to the conclusion that the center of the ring could be the mouth of a tunnel, or a gateway to another existence. But how do I find out? This big, weird thing." He fast-forwarded some more. "September 25th. For 3 days I've been sending objects into the void. A paper airplane, a Rubik's Cube, even a model of T-Rex. I figured the carnivore could take care of himself. All vanished without a trace. Last night I perfected a timing device designed to return things from wherever it is they're going. I sent another object in." Here the tape stopped for a moment, then resumed. 19 minutes and 40 seconds ago, with the timer set on 20 minutes. With any luck, it should be returning right about..." Before the on-screen Quinn could say the word "now," the gate made a loud cracking noise, and a regulation basketball shot out of the void and bounced across the floor into the corner. As the bouncing diminished, a devilish smile spread across Quinn's face. "And the crowd goes wild," Quinn said. Next up was a shot of Quinn sitting before the TV set, with Schrödinger tucked under his arm. "September 26th. I've been thinking about sending Schrödinger through. First cat into the void. But if anything were to happen, I know I couldn't live with that. Still, the need to know overwhelms the human instinct for self-preservation. Of course, sending the camera is the logical choice, but the electrical field nukes the picture. So all I have to do is work up my nerve. The day after tomorrow, first thing in the morning, I myself will step through the gate and finally see what's on the other side." He stopped the tape and idly picked up a basketball, holding it up to his face, like Hamlet inspecting Yorick's skull. "What the hell am I going to find on the other side?" he asked the blue vortex. Quinn woke up with a start, listening to the answer he'd been seeking for so long. For a moment, he thought the blue vortex was speaking to him, but rubbing the sleep from his eyes revealed that he was in his bedroom, where he'd fallen asleep from exhaustion the night before. At least he'd taken off his shoes before collapsing onto the bed. The mysterious voice continued speaking, courtesy of his clock radio. He could sleep through normal alarms. A blaring radio disc jockey, on the other hand, could wake the dead. He looked around, taking a quick inventory of his world. An old basketball hoop attached to the wall, a dirty jersey hanging in it like a trophy of war. His telescope, turned so he could see the "I Brake for Asteroids" sticker. A dented globe of the world dating back to junior high school. More recent acquisitions included his latest laptop, a pretty good surfboard, clothes strewn all over the floor as if proving the thesis of his many books on chaos theory, and finally, Schrödinger had taken up residence at the foot of his bed, right next to a textbook on hyperspace. "Good morning, Bay Area," the radio voice continued. Spaceman here, shattering your sleep with the truth and nothing but. They all had a special moniker, Quinn figured, because otherwise there was no way to tell them apart. He'd often thought the secret of Rush Limbaugh's success was simply that the man had a distinctive voice rather than the generic white-bread robot announcer voice. Friends, I hear we're being invaded, Spaceman continued. Hordes of earthquake-freaked Southern Californians are flocking to our city, bringing all the wonderful things that make LA so special. Carjackings, tacos, drive-bys, and silicone. Some might say I'm being paranoid, but believe me, I can smell a Dodger fan a mile away. They're here, you've been warned. Food for thought from your humble spaceman, loyal green-blooded siren of the airwaves. The next sound you hear will be blessed silence, said Quinn, hitting the off button. His mouth tasted like yesterday. First thing to do was get a mouthful of Listerine, and the second was to tumble into the shower and wash away his worries. Mom was waiting for him downstairs. The proof of how much she cared for her son was that she hit the mute button on her remote, rendering the morning show on TV more intelligent, so she could talk to him. Ma, I gotta fly. I got a million things to do today, he said, grabbing the cat food. Part of the deal with Mom was he took care of Schrodinger. Eat, she said, doing her best wasp impression of a Jewish mother. You're too much like your father. Up all night, working crazy hours, and look what happened to him. He worked himself to death. One of the advantages of being an eternal hippie chick was the ability to cloud your own mind. Quinn debated letting the comment pass, but he just couldn't, a trait he shared with his dad. Mom, he said gently, he was hit by a car. She couldn't be thrown off track that easily. But he was on his way to work, she announced triumphantly. That's my point. He had too much on his mind. Quinn walked over and put his hand to her cheek. Better than too little. She wiped at her eyes. Is that the same shirt you had on yesterday? She asked, changing the subject. Uh-oh. Now she had him on the defensive. I just took a shower, he announced, like MacArthur announcing a victory in the Philippines. That wasn't the question. Mom had a good sense of tactics. He began, trying to work up a plausible lie. Young man, there's a clean pile of clothes on the dryer. Run downstairs and pick something. There was nothing to do but surrender with good grace. Well, Mom, it's about time you got to those. That pile's been on my floor for a week. Then he took a calculated risk. So when are you going to make up the room? He thought that he could dodge the dish towel in her hand. He was wrong. You just watch it, Buster. 2 more semesters and I'm turning this place into a bed and breakfast. I got dibs on the basement, Quinn reminded her. She laughed and repeated her favorite phrase. Ha! That's the only reason you're not on the streets already. It'd take years to get rid of all that junk. He always did his part of the script. It's not junk. She pretended not to hear. Of course, you're pretty useful around the house. You're good at killing bugs and spiders, and you've built up some nice muscles bringing in the grocery bags. Whenever she listed his attributes, he usually found something else to do. After he left the room, she put her hand on the family picture, and her fingers tapped on the face of her late husband. You know, Michael, I worry about that kid sometimes. He's too smart for his own good. Who are you talking to? Asked Quinn, coming back in the room. Your father and I were just having a private conversation. Well, tell him I said hi.